Hey everyone, this is John. Welcome to Random Clickbait. Today we're doing something a little different. Today I'm doing an introduction to interrogations. Now, prior to 1740, judicial torture was a means of investigation commonly used. It was also used as a part of other ordeals. There remain three types of ordeals: divination, a physical test, a battle, where it's combat, ordeal by combat, where it's thought that God would only allow the victor of these ordeals to live. And that's how they investigated crime. I mean, honestly, judicial torture and ordeals was commonplace. In order to convict, they needed confessions, and that's why judicial torture was so important because it was really their only means of investigation. It was not only the only evidence; it was evidence par excellence. So it's like double reinforced the need for this confession. And at the time, there was not really much forensics available to people other than torture, and here and there finding evidence of the crime, physical evidence. Uh, 1832, an anonymous practical criminalist published a short text offering their experience in urging magistrates to study the developing field of psychology. This criminalist, you could think of it like criminology, someone who studies criminals and criminal behavior. He said, and I'm taking this from Hoffman, 2022, this anonymous criminalist said, with the knowledge of psychology, you could see into the secret engines of the soul and compel the truth out of the accused, even against their will. So the use of psychology was going to be for two main purposes, and I called it sort of the new coercion. Instead of like physically coercing people into confessing, um, you're tricking them or using your knowledge of psychology. And they used it in two main ways. The first, to interpret the signs of the accused body to see if they displayed, is their face reddened, hands sweaty, are they looking away? That type of cue, signs. And also, the second one was to sort of use it as a means of manipulation to make people more likely to confess. The semiotics of the body and soul. So, semiotics, the study of signs and symbols, their use and interpretations, Oxford Languages 2024. And this is building on what I said in the previous side. And this is what this field of psychology then, we're think 1800s, before Freud, not heavy theory, very practical, like pragmatic knowledge of human behavior, such as like people sometimes stutter when they lie, or sometimes their hands sweat, or they look away when confronted with these. And these are the semiotics of the body and soul, and that's what psychology was offering up as a key. Now, sadly, in 1936, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the case of Brown v. Mississippi. Now we're talking about 100 years or so later, because the Practical Criminalist was in 1832. He wrote that, and then it was Prussia. Now it's Germany. So about 100 years later, in the U.S., the Supreme Court hears Brown v. Mississippi, 1936. And this case involves the use of torture to induce a confession of three black men for the murder of a white man, Raymond Stewart. The saga, I would say, or the case, or the facts of the case begin with Deputy Dial, who, accompanied by a mob of white men, went to the home of Duke Ellington to force him to leave with them. The mob found a close tree nearby, placed a noose, not a nuke, a noose around the man's neck, and raised him up and down several times, trying to coerce him into confession using torture, judicial torture, you could say, to induce a confession. He refused and was released, but a few days later, he was picked up again. And unfortunately, on the way to this Mississippi jail, he was driven through the state of Alabama, sort of to bypass laws, or to make it more difficult to prosecute. And he was taken out of the car and whipped until he eventually did confess. So after his confession, they go after two other people. Duke Ellington's confession, Deputy Dial, accompanied by a jailer and a mob of white men, took Ed Browns and Henry Shields to the county jail, where they were made to strip and were beaten naked with a whip until they confessed. Chief Justice Hughes wrote the opinion for this case, and what stands out is this quote taken from his opinion. Because a state may dispense with a jury trial, it does not follow that it may substitute trial by ordeal. The rack and chamber torture may not be substituted for the witness stand. Now, an interesting and key thing to know is what is the difference between an interview and an interrogation? Suspects, even those with evidence against them, should first be interviewed and observed for the signs, those semiotics of guilt. During the interview, Hoffman, a different Hoffman, 2005, said you should pay particular attention to the person's skin and face to notice signs of discomfort, reddening, or hives. The carotid pulse can be observed to see if the pulse quickens and rises. Even if these are seen, the interview should remain non-accusatory. So that is really the difference between an interview and interrogation, is the accusatory aspect of the interrogation. Now, I'm going to talk about Miranda. Miranda is a warning meant to be given to you when you're in custodial interrogations. In Miranda v. Arizona in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that custodial interrogation are inherently coercive and must be prefaced with a reminder of the right to counsel and to remain silent and end the interrogation if requested. Now, this is only regarding custodial interrogations. So that brings up our next question. Are you in custody? Custodial interrogations are defined as questioning initiated by law enforcement after a person has been taken into custody or otherwise deprived of his freedom of action in any significant way. Now, the Supreme Court would address this in 1995 in Thompson versus Keohane, and the Supreme Court clarified what constituted custodial interrogation by the reasonable person standard that consists of two parts: the surroundings and circumstances, and given that, would a reasonable person consider themselves in custody? So this is the reasonable person standard. Would you think you're in custody? Are you locked in a room? Have you freedom been restricted in any other way? Would a reasonable person, would a normal average person think they were in custody? And that's the standard. And that's when you must be given your Miranda rights. And we'll see how important this is later. In interrogations, now Hoffman 2005 offers insight into interrogations with the next couple of suggestions on the room and approach. Now you should have the room be bare as possible and have no reminders of law enforcement or other signs of punishment. And Hoffman 2005 offered a somewhat funny example of like having the Investigator of the Year award on the wall in your interrogation room. Like you see the wall behind me, definitely don't want to do interrogation in here. More reminds me of the Usual Suspects beings with Kaiser Sose. But, so you want the room as bare as possible. Rapport. Now this is something very important in interrogation. The building of rapport begins with non-threatening and simple questions. Like, where do you live? How old are you? How do you spell your last name? Hoffman 2005 writes of mirroring. Now, mirroring is a conversational phenomenon where the speakers mirror each other's mannerisms and way of speaking. And an easy test offered by Hoffman is to move one's legs slightly to observe if the other person follows suit. If so, rapport has been established. So that's a way you can see, has rapport been established? Is the person I'm interacting with, are they mirroring me? Are we talking in a similar way? Are we using the same, ways of speaking or the same slang? The Wicklander-Zulaski method, or WZ method as I'll refer to it from here on, is an accusatory interview that begins with non-accusatory statements to observe the subject's behavior. The interviewer describes who they are, what they do. They present themselves as a protector and also a protector of the person being interviewed. And during the interview, they offer minimizations and rationalizations for the defense, like it wasn't so bad, or maybe she was asking for it, or things like that. Rationalization, minimizations, to sort of make the person feel more comfortable in confessing to something they feel is lesser than just like the outright offense of, say, an essay or actual assault or something. But it ends in an open accusation like, hey, you did this. Now we're going to move on to the next most popular method used by most police officers is the read technique. As I said, it's the most common technique used by law enforcement. You ask the subject, what they know about the crime, if they were involved, what should happen to the person who did it, and do they have an alibi? Now, as this will be done using the Read Interview Tabulation Sheet, which consists of a Miranda warning at the beginning, 15 questions, and medical data, where you can mark next to each thing whether you felt the person was being honest or not. And based on those semiotics, the signs of the body, you can move the interview into an active interrogation. Now, there are some concerns about retrained officers. Retrained officers are more likely to use deception and minimization technique. Like I said, the minimization, maximization, which we'll get to next. And also like tricks like to avoid you giving someone a Miranda warning, they'll say, oh, you're free to go. So you don't have to give the Miranda warning because they're free to go. So therefore, they're not in custody. They also can use like prompts, like they can have videotapes here saying, they can't say, hey, this videotape shows you committing the crime, but they can imply that they have evidence, you know, maybe it's a videotape. We certainly have videotapes here. Maybe it's on here. They can use prompts to deceive you, and that is legal. They can just not fabricate complete evidence. They can just make it up whole cloth and be like, this is evidence against you. Now, minimization and maximization are part of the read technique where they minimize the role and the seriousness of the offense and sort of maximize the benefits of cooperation. So you say it wasn't so bad. Instead of a murder, you say self-defense or he started it. You know what I mean? It won't be a big deal. Help me out. I'll help you. You know, things of that nature. Coercion, tactics, and efficacy. Now, the main motivation people give for giving false confessions is to escape the police pressure. Um, and the most effective way to break down a suspect's resistance is first, intimidation. Two, a robust challenge is where you openly say, no, that is a lie. That is not true. And three, manipulation, you know, that presentation of props or, you know, the implying that they have evidence that they don't, but that is manipulation. And there's a great citation here by Goldemon, 1976. I hope I didn't butcher that too bad. Coercion is at its zenith when there's only one choice of consequence available. When there's only one thing that matters that you can do, you're being coerced. Now, Chinese police tactics, interrogation tactics, police interrogation tactics. So, the Chinese police rely on the exploitation of three main forms of universal human vulnerability. The first is our need for attachment to others. This is a dimension of our lives that can be precarious and reinforced or disrupted by established social arrangements. The second is our linear experience of time and the infinite improbability of actions and our frailty and fears about the future. The third is the realization that what is done cannot be undone and will be remembered by those around us and place limits on our ability to choose certain paths over others. Chinese police use a technique called luring the snake out of the hole. Now, this is know your suspect. For most suspects, their vulnerability is their family. A crucial part of this approach, luring the snake out of the hole, is to remind the suspects of their need to care for their mother or children. Being cut off from human contact and placed in a cell, the suspects are reminded of their anonymity and degraded. You're a nobody. Do you think the world cares that you're in here? So this is that minimization, maximization, just culturally tailored to a more collective culture where family matters more than, I guess, snitching on your fellow suspects. The Army Field Manual. Now, the Army Field Manual has two general approaches. There is the direct approach. This is just a straightforward, you know, interrogation. You did this, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the incentive approach where, you know, they incentivize cooperation. And to do this, they rely on 7 emotional approaches. Emotional love. This is using the suspect's feelings of love and loyalty against them. Emotional hate, using their feelings of hate. Emotional fear up is where you magnify the fear of the situation. Emotional fear down, reduce the fear of cooperating and where they're at. Emotional pride, you give them a big ego boost, you know, encouraging cooperation. Ego up is emotional pride to encourage cooperation. Ego down is used to reduce the source's feelings of importance and value. And emotional futility induces and creates a sense of futility. Now, in terms of efficacy and methods, the approach we know it all approach, where the interrogator creates the illusion that they know everything, so you might as well do it. Their direct approach, according to the Army Field Manual, has been 90% effective since World War II. And positive and negative approaches were found by Evans, Evan and colleagues, rather, 2014 to be more effective than the direct approach. All right, in conclusion, the the Prussian response to prohibition on the use of judicial torture was a turn to the budding field of psychology in the 1800s. They did this to enable the manipulation of the accused inner world and enable the recovery of the truth of the crime, even against their will. Hoffman, 2022, page 319. Over a century later, in Brown v. Mississippi, 1936, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the torture and rack chamber cannot replace the witness stand, and ruled coerced confessions would not be admissible as evidence. And what we see, even though these changes were a century apart, they both turn to a new means of coercion, and that new means of coercion is psychology.